The morning sun had barely peeked through the windows of LAX Airport when Flight 247 began its routine boarding process. Among the rushing passengers and rumbling suitcases, Linda Thompson, a flight attendant with crow's feet that hinted at her 15 years of experience, was going through her usual pre-flight checklist in first class. She loved her job, despite its challenges. Every flight brought new faces, new stories, and occasionally, new problems to solve. Today seemed like any other day, until it wasn't. As passengers filed in, Linda noticed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses settling into seat 3A. There was something familiar about him, the way he carried himself, his height, even his smile as he thanked another flight attendant for helping with his carry-on. He looked exactly like Will Smith, but his boarding pass showed a completely different name. Linda had seen it all before. Celebrity impersonators weren't uncommon on LA flights, and some were incredibly convincing. Last month, she dealt with a passenger who'd spent the entire flight pretending to be Tom Cruise, disturbing other passengers and asking them to film TikTok videos with him. As she arranged the welcome drinks, she kept one eye on 3A. The man was quietly reading a script, making notes in the margins with a red pen. He was good, she thought. Really good. He had Will Smith's mannerisms down perfectly, right down to the way he occasionally rubbed his chin while reading. The first signs of trouble started during the boarding process. A young passenger, probably around 12, did a double take while walking past 3A. His eyes went wide, and he tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly. Soon, whispers rippled through the first-class cabin. Is that Will Smith? It has to be him. Should we ask for a photo? Linda felt her stomach tighten. She'd seen how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. The last thing she needed was a cabin full of excited passengers crowding around an impersonator, especially when they were trying to complete the boarding process. A businessman in 4C was the first to approach, confidently extending his hand. Mr. Smith, I'm a huge fan. Would you mind if we took a quick photo? The man in 3A responded with warmth and that signature Will Smith charm, but something about his response made Linda pause. He didn't seem to be playing it up or seeking attention like most impersonators did. Instead, he was trying to keep his voice down, speaking quietly and gesturing apologetically to his script. More passengers began to notice, and soon a small crowd was forming in the aisle. Linda watched as the man handled each interaction with grace, but she could see the situation was getting out of hand. The boarding process was being delayed, and other passengers were starting to look annoyed. She'd been trained to handle situations like this. Passenger safety and comfort came first, and right now, both were being compromised. As she approached 3A, straightening her navy blue uniform, Linda felt confident in her assessment of the situation. She'd dealt with celebrity impersonators before, and she knew exactly how to handle this, firmly but professionally. What she didn't know was that she was about to learn an important lesson about assumptions, one that would change not just her day, but her entire approach to her job. As she got closer to seat 3A, preparing to address the situation, she had no idea that this moment would soon become a story shared around the world, for reasons she never could have expected. The tension in the cabin was building, and Linda took a deep breath. She had to act now, before things got any more out of hand. Little did she know, her next words would set in motion a chain of events that would make her question everything she thought she knew about judgment, humility, and the power of a graceful response to a difficult situation. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when the situation in first class began to intensify. Linda watched as more passengers seized any opportunity to walk past seat 3A, phones clutched hopefully in their hands. The man she believed to be a Will Smith impersonator was handling each interruption with remarkable patience, but she could see the disruption was affecting other passengers. Mrs. Richardson in 2B, a regular business traveler Linda recognized from previous flights, was trying to work on her laptop. her fingers drumming with increasing irritation on her armrest. The elderly couple in 5A and 5B kept turning around to see what all the commotion was about, their rest clearly disturbed by the constant movement in the aisle. This has gone far enough, Linda thought, smoothing down her uniform as she prepared to address the situation. She'd handled similar scenarios before, but something about this one felt different. The man wasn't actively seeking attention like most impersonators did. Instead, he seemed to be trying his best to focus on his script while politely managing the constant interruptions. Just then, a new wave of visitors arrived from economy class, having somehow heard about Will Smith in first class. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8, clutched a paper airplane he'd made from the safety card, looking at the man in 3A with pure wonder in his eyes. Linda stepped in before the boy could approach. "I'm sorry, but passengers need to remain in their assigned cabin sections," she said firmly but kindly to the boy and his apologetic-looking father. As she turned to escort them back, she overheard the man in 3 quietly offering to sign the paper airplane. His voice, his mannerisms, everything about him was perfect. Too perfect. That was the final straw. The safety of all passengers was her responsibility, and this situation was quickly becoming untenable. Linda took a deep breath and approached seat 3A, clipboard in hand. "Sir," she began in a low professional tone, "I need to speak with you about the disruption you're causing." The man looked up, his expression curious but calm. "I understand you're very good at what you do, but pretending to be Will Smith is creating a safety concern. If this continues, we'll need to move you to another section of the aircraft." The cabin fell silent. Even the constant hum of the engines seemed to fade away as passengers watched the scene unfold. The man slowly removed his sunglasses, and for the first time, Linda got a clear look at his face. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ID. "I understand your concern," he said quietly, "but there seems to be a misunderstanding." His voice carried that unmistakable Will Smith tone, but now it wasn't just an impression. "I'm traveling under a different name for privacy reasons. I hope you can understand." Linda felt the color drain from her face as she looked at the ID, then back at the man. The realization hit her like a wave of turbulence. This wasn't an impersonator at all. She was standing in front of the actual Will Smith, and she had just accused him of being a fake. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she held his ID. The other flight attendants had stopped their service, watching with a mixture of horror and fascination. Linda could feel the eyes of every passenger burning into her back, waiting to see what would happen next. In all her years of flying, she'd never felt more mortified. Her mind raced with potential ways to handle this situation, but every thought seemed inadequate. How does one recover from accusing Will Smith of being an impersonator of himself? What happened next would not only surprise Linda, but would become a story that would inspire thousands of people around the world. As she stood there, frozen in her embarrassment, Will Smith's response would teach everyone on that flight an unexpected lesson about grace, understanding, and the power of human connection. The tension in the first-class cabin could have been cut with a knife. Linda stood frozen, still holding Will Smith's ID, her face burning with embarrassment. The other passengers watched in complete silence, many with phones discreetly raised, hoping to capture what happened next. "I'm so terribly sorry, Mr. Smith," Linda finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to hand back his ID, but her hands were shaking so much that she nearly dropped it. Years of professional training seemed to evaporate in an instant, leaving her feeling like it was her first day on the job. What happened next caught everyone by surprise. Will Smith smiled, not the polite, dismissive smile of a celebrity who'd been inconvenienced, but a warm, genuine one that reached his eyes. He leaned forward in his seat and spoke in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You know what? Let's talk about this," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "I think there's something valuable here for all of us to learn." The way he said it wasn't condescending or showy, it was sincere, like he genuinely saw this awkward moment as an opportunity. Linda hesitated. In 15 years of flying, she'd never sat down with a passenger mid-flight, let alone one she'd just wrongly accused. But there was something in Will Smith's expression that made her take that seat, despite every professional instinct telling her to retreat to the galley and hide for the rest of the flight. First off, he began, "You were doing exactly what you should have been doing, protecting your passengers. That's your job, and you shouldn't feel bad about that." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But let me tell you a story about assumptions and how they once almost cost me everything." The other flight attendants had taken over the drink service, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but everyone was listening. Even Mrs. Richardson had closed her laptop. Will shared a personal story about his early days in Hollywood, when people had made assumptions about him being just another rapper trying to act. He talked about how those assumptions could have bitter him, but instead became fuel for his determination to prove himself. "The easy thing for me right now would be to get upset or demand special treatment," he continued, his voice carrying that natural warmth that had made him beloved by millions. But what would that solve? Instead, let's turn this into something positive. Linda felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of embarrassment anymore. They were tears of relief and gratitude. Here she was, having made possibly the biggest mistake of her career, and instead of facing anger or demands to be fired, she was receiving a masterclass in grace and understanding. The elderly couple from 5A and 5B had turned completely around in their seats now, no longer pretending not to listen. The businessman who'd first asked for a photo had put his phone down, completely absorbed in the moment. "You know what the real problem is?" Will asked, looking around the cabin. "It's not that you thought I was an impersonator. It's that we live in a world where we're all so quick to judge, so ready to assume the worst. But what if we all took a breath before jumping to conclusions?" Just then, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged on, but nobody moved. The momentary shakiness seemed to emphasize the power of the moment. How life's bumpy moments often lead to the most meaningful connections. "Mr. Smith, I don't know what to say," Linda began, but he gently interrupted her. "Call me Will," he said with a smile, "and you don't need to say anything. Just promise me you'll share this story. Not because it's about me, but because it's about something bigger, how we all have the power to turn an awkward moment into a beautiful one." The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause, not the kind you might hear at a movie premiere, but the genuine kind that comes from witnessing something real and touching. As Linda stood up to return to her duties, she realized this flight would be one she'd remember for the rest of her life. Not for the mistake she'd made, but for the unexpected lesson in humanity that followed. The mood in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically. What had started as an embarrassing confrontation had transformed into something almost magical. As Linda resumed her duties, she noticed how the other passengers were looking at her differently now. Not with judgment, but with a kind of understanding that made her heart feel lighter. The head purser, Robert, had heard about the situation and came to check on things. He'd rushed up from economy class, prepared for damage control, only to find Will Smith and the other passengers engaged in one of the most remarkable conversations he'd ever witnessed on a flight. "You know what's funny?" Will said, addressing the cabin as Robert stood there surprised. "I was actually reading a script about misconceptions when all this happened." He held up the papers he'd been reviewing earlier. "It's about a guy who learns that his biggest mistakes lead to his greatest moments of growth. Seems pretty fitting right now, doesn't it?" Several passengers laughed, and the atmosphere grew even warmer. The young boy with the paper airplane, who had snuck back up from economy despite the earlier warning, was now sitting cross-legged in the aisle near Will's seat. Nobody had the heart to send him back this time. "Can you tell us about shooting I Am Legend?" the boy asked boldly, clutching his signed paper airplane. Instead of dismissing the question, Will looked at Linda with a twinkle in his eye. "Well, since we've still got a few hours left in this flight, and if our wonderful flight attendant doesn't mind." He paused, waiting for Linda's nod of approval. "I'll tell you all about it, but first, I want to hear everyone else's stories about times they learned from their mistakes. Because that's what makes us human, right?" For the next hour, something extraordinary happened at 35,000 feet. First-class passengers began sharing their own stories of misconceptions and lessons learned. The businessman from 4C admitted he'd once missed out on a life-changing partnership because he judged someone by their appearance. Mrs. Richardson shared how she'd almost fired an employee for poor performance, only to discover they were dealing with personal tragedy and needed support, not criticism. Even the elderly couple joined in, sharing a story about how they'd initially disapproved of their daughter's career choice, only to later realize their prejudices had clouded their judgment. Their daughter was now a successful tattoo artist who had found her true calling. Linda watched all this unfold while serving drinks and ensuring everyone's comfort, but she was no longer just a flight attendant going through the motions. She had become part of something bigger, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual barriers of status and circumstance. Will continued engaging with everyone, not as a celebrity dispensing wisdom from above, but as a fellow traveler sharing in this unexpected moment of community. He listened to each story with genuine interest, offering thoughtful responses that showed he was truly present in the moment. "You see," he said during a quiet moment, "we're all on this flight together, literally and figuratively. We can choose to just sit in our seats, minds closed, waiting to land, or we can open ourselves up to learning from each other." The plane's gentle hum seemed to provide a perfect backdrop for this impromptu gathering. Outside the windows, the sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. Inside, something equally beautiful was happening. Strangers were becoming friends, assumptions were being challenged, and hearts were opening. Robert, still standing at the back of the cabin, pulled out his phone and quietly took a picture. Not of Will Smith, but of the entire scene, the engaged faces, the animated conversations, the sense of community that had spontaneously emerged. He knew that in all his years of flying, he'd never witnessed anything quite like this. As the flight progressed into its final hours, the impact of what had happened began to sink in for everyone aboard. The first-class cabin had transformed from a space of luxury and isolation into something that felt more like a cozy living room where old friends gathered to share stories. Linda was in the galley, preparing for the final service, when Will Smith approached her. She noticed he'd taken off his cap and sunglasses completely now, no longer concerned about maintaining his privacy. The authenticity of the moment had made such disguises seem unnecessary. "You know," he said, leaning against the galley wall, "I've been thinking about what happened earlier. Would you mind if I shared something personal with you?" Linda nodded, setting down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "Years ago, I made a movie called The Pursuit of Happiness," he began, his voice thoughtful. "There was this scene where my character gets judged harshly because of his appearance. While filming it, I thought I understood what that felt like. But today, watching you handle what must have been an incredibly embarrassing situation with such grace, that taught me something new." The older couple from 5A and 5B walked past to use the restroom, smiling warmly at both of them. The whole atmosphere of the flight had changed so dramatically that it was hard to remember the tension from earlier. "The truth is," Will continued, "most celebrities would have handled this differently. They might have gotten angry, demanded special treatment, or tried to get you in trouble. But what would that accomplish? Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the chance to learn and grow." Just then, the young boy with the paper airplane, who had been allowed to stay in first class after Will had a quiet word with the crew, came up to them. "Mr. Will," he said shyly, "I told my mom what happened, and she said it's the best lesson I could learn about being a good person." Will crouched down to the boy's level, something Linda noticed he did naturally, not as a performative gesture. "And what lesson is that?" he asked, genuinely curious. That even famous people can be kind when others make mistakes, the boy replied, clutching his paper airplane like a treasure. The businessman from 4C, overhearing this, stepped into the galley conversation. You know what's remarkable? He said. I came on this flight preparing for another boring business trip, probably would have worked the whole way. Instead, I'm leaving with a story I'll tell for the rest of my life. Linda felt tears welling up again, but these were different from her earlier tears of embarrassment. These were tears of gratitude for being part of something so unexpectedly meaningful. I've been thinking, Will said, addressing everyone within earshot, about how this whole situation is like a movie script, but better because it's real. We've got all the elements: conflict, resolution, character growth, and most importantly, a message that matters. Mrs. Richardson, who had long since abandoned her laptop work, joined the growing group in the galley. And what's the message? She asked, though her smile suggested she already knew. That our worst moments can become our best teachers, Will replied, but only if we're willing to learn from them. And more importantly, only if others are willing to give us the chance to learn. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, causing everyone to grab onto something for balance. Someone laughed, commenting how even the turbulence couldn't break the special atmosphere that had developed. As Linda looked around at all these people, strangers just hours ago, now connected by this shared experience, she realized something profound. In trying to maintain order on her flight, she'd accidentally created disorder, but that disorder had led to something far more valuable: genuine human connection. As the pilot announced their descent into New York, everyone in first class felt a touch of sadness, knowing their unique experience was coming to an end. The past few hours had been unlike anything any of them had experienced on a flight before. Linda was helping passengers prepare for landing when she overheard snippets of conversations that made her pause. People weren't talking about movies or business meetings anymore. They were discussing how they'd apply today's lessons in their own lives. The businessman from 4C was telling the elderly couple how he planned to change his company's hiring practices, focusing less on first impressions and more on giving people real chances. You never know someone's story until you take the time to listen, he said, echoing Will's earlier words. Mrs. Richardson had done something completely unexpected. She'd closed her laptop hours ago and hadn't opened it since. Instead, she'd been writing notes on her phone about expanding her company's employee support programs. Sometimes people just need understanding, not judgment, she explained to those around her. Will Smith, who had remained remarkably engaged throughout the flight, was now having a quiet conversation with Robert, the head purser. You know what's beautiful about this? Will said, gesturing to the cabin. Nobody's filming this for social media. Nobody's trying to go viral. It's just real people having real conversations. The young boy with the paper airplane had fallen asleep in his mother's lap. She'd been invited up to first class as well. His precious paper airplane, now covered in signatures from everyone in the cabin, was clutched tightly in his hands. Linda noticed how Will kept glancing at the boy with a gentle smile, probably remembering his own children at that age. Linda, Will called out as she passed by, I have an idea I'd like to run by you. He explained how he wanted to help create a training program for flight attendants, not about celebrity encounters, but about turning difficult moments into opportunities for connection. Your story, our story, could help change how people think about mistakes and judgment. The elderly couple, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. We've been flying for over 40 years, the husband said, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. This is the first time we felt like we were part of a family up here, not just passengers. His wife nodded in agreement. And to think, it all started with a misunderstanding. Makes you wonder how many other beautiful moments we missed because we're too afraid of making mistakes. The plane began its final descent, the lights of New York twinkling below like stars fallen to earth. Linda started her final checks, but everything felt different now. Each interaction with a passenger wasn't just part of her job. It was an opportunity for connection. Will stood up to stretch before landing, and the entire cabin fell silent, sensing he had something to say. "You know, I've been thinking," he began, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had helped diffuse the tension hours earlier. "We all came on this flight thinking we were just traveling from point A to point B. Instead, we ended up on a different kind of journey altogether." He paused, looking around at all the faces that had become familiar over the past few hours. Sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we read in scripts or see on screen. They're the ones we live when we're brave enough to be real with each other. The descent continued, and Linda noticed something remarkable. Despite the usual end-of-flight rush to check phones and gather belongings, most passengers remained engaged in conversation, savoring these final moments of their unexpected community. As the plane's wheels touched down at JFK, Linda realized that while the flight was ending, something much bigger was just beginning. This wasn't just a story about a celebrity and a flight attendant anymore. It had become a lesson about humanity that none of them would ever forget. 1 month after that remarkable flight, the story had taken on a life of its own. Not in the way most celebrity encounters go viral, with flashy headlines and sensational claims, but in a quieter, more meaningful way that touched people's hearts. Linda sat in her living room, still amazed at how her biggest professional mistake had turned into something so beautiful. Her phone buzzed with another message. It was from the businessman in 4C. He just hired a new employee who'd been rejected by other companies because of his appearance. "Sometimes the best talent comes in unexpected packages," his message read. "Thanks for helping me learn that." The transformation hadn't stopped with the passengers from that flight. Will Smith had kept his word about the training program. He'd worked with the airline to develop a new approach to customer service, focusing on turning challenging moments into opportunities for connection. They called it the human factor, and Linda had been asked to help train other flight attendants. "Remember that flight attendant who thought I was an impersonator?" Will had said during a recent talk show appearance. "She taught me something powerful about grace. We all make mistakes, but it's how we handle them that matters." He hadn't mentioned Linda by name, respecting her privacy, but his words had sparked a conversation of judgment and understanding that reached far beyond that single flight. The young boy's paper airplane had found a special home. His mother had it framed, along with a photo of everyone from first class and a simple caption: "The day we learned that mistakes can be beautiful." She'd sent Linda a picture of it hanging in their home, a reminder that small moments can have big impacts. Mrs. Richardson had made changes too. Her company now had a new policy that required managers to have meaningful conversations with employees before making any major decisions about their futures. "It's amazing how much you learn when you just take the time to listen," she'd written in a company-wide memo that went viral on LinkedIn. The elderly couple had started a tradition of their own. Every time they flew, they'd share the story with someone new, spreading its message of understanding and connection. Their daughter, the tattoo artist, had even created a design inspired by the story: a paper airplane with the words "Judge less, understand more" wrapped around it. One evening, as Linda prepared for another flight, she received an unexpected package. Inside was a framed note from Will Smith. "Thank you for reminding me that our greatest moments often come disguised as our biggest mistakes. Keep spreading the magic." Along with it was a first edition copy of the script he'd been reading that day, now published as a successful film that included a scene inspired by their encounter. Robert, the head purser, had been right to capture that moment with his phone. The photo he'd taken, not of Will Smith the celebrity, but of a group of strangers becoming friends, had become part of the airline's training materials. It showed what was possible when people chose connection over judgment, understanding over assumption. The airline industry had noticed too. Other companies began adopting similar training approaches, recognizing that in an age of increasing automation and disconnection, the human touch mattered more than ever. Linda found herself invited to speak at industry conferences. sharing how one moment of vulnerability had created ripples of positive change. The funny thing is, Linda often said during these talks, "I used to think success meant never making mistakes. Now I know it's about what we learn from them, and more importantly, what we help others learn too." As she boarded her next flight, Linda carried with her not just the memory of that special day, but the knowledge that every interaction held the potential for something extraordinary. Each passenger she greeted might be carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own chance to learn or teach something meaningful. The story of the flight attendant and Will Smith had become more than just a tale of mistaken identity. It had become a reminder that in a world quick to judge and slow to understand, the most powerful connections often begin with our most human moments.